The Great Believers is a 2018 novel by Rebecca Makkai, who you might know for her more recent I Have Some Questions for You. It's an 18-hour-long audiobook. So is this a book you can believe in, or is it a great bust? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. When Rebecca Makkai released The Great Believers in 2018, it got all sorts of acclaim. It won the following awards: the ALA Carnegie Medal, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the ALA Stonewall Award, and the Chicago Review of Books Award. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. So what's the big whoop over this book? The novel follows two connected stories, the first of which is set in Chicago in 1985. It follows a character named Yale Tishman. Now, Yale Tishman is a young man who is working for Northwestern University, and he's trying to bring in a really big donation for the art collection. Now, while this is happening in Yale's life, essentially his entire social circle and much of his community is dying. The AIDS epidemic has hit. Now, you might wonder what art collecting has to do with the AIDS epidemic, and honestly, not a whole lot. But what it does is it normalizes Yale, and it also gives us something to compare to as far as how AIDS is impacting not just health in his community, but also his life. So seeing him at his job is important. We alternate between the story of Yale and his art with a story of a woman named Fiona Marcus. Now, Yale and Fiona are connected. At the very, very beginning of the book, we're set in a funeral. And it's a funeral for Fiona's brother, Nico, who is dear, dear friends with Yale. He's in fact Yale's very first friend to die of the virus. So we right away realize the importance of their connection, but we learn about the depth of their relationship throughout the story. For much of the book, Fiona is in France, and she's looking for her estranged daughter. Now, you might also wonder, how does this have anything to do with AIDS? But it really is about seeing the impact of what that time period of the beginning of the AIDS crisis had on other characters. Fiona has not contracted the virus, but she was for sure impacted by the losses, and we're seeing that 30 years later. So it's really important that we get to see it in the moment that it's all beginning, but also down the line. And Makkai does that really brilliantly. Their two stories are very different. Yale and Fiona practically exist in completely different times, but what it allows us is to see the connection between how people were impacted either directly via their health and their life and their social circles, or through sort of long-term trauma from this disease. So it's a really important balanced perspective that Makkai is able to write, since she is writing this book so many years after the onset of the AIDS crisis. Before I talk about this next part, I want to make something very clear. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 versus the AIDS crisis. My goal is in no way to make the two seem the same in scale or impact, but I want to talk about how COVID-19 helps me relate and understand this book a little differently. Rebecca Makkai published this book before COVID-19. I was alive for some of the beginning of the AIDS crisis, but I was too young to really understand. So COVID-19, for me, is the vehicle through which I can understand some of this. It's not the same thing. It's not targeted towards one group of people. People were not excluded from care during COVID-19. There definitely was a more universal approach with COVID-19. But when I think about the way it felt at the beginning of COVID-19, where there were so many unknowns and everything felt dangerous and people were dying and we didn't really know why, I feel like that teeny tiny bit helps me understand just a fraction of what it must have been like to be a homosexual in the 80s. I'm not trying to say that COVID and AIDS are the same. They're not. They're not even close. The impact of AIDS on the gay community was enormous. And COVID, while worldwide and hitting all types of people, was severe. It's very different. It's not targeted like AIDS was. And my goal is not to say that they're the same, but rather simply that COVID is the closest I've ever consciously seen in my lifetime. So I can't even imagine what it must have felt like to be in the gay community in the 1980s, given the teeny bit that I know about COVID. Rebecca Makkai writes a strong novel with really good characters and really good dialogue. I really wanted to give this book a 5, but for me, it just was way too long. I think she could have honestly told the same story in half the length and probably had the same impact. Now, I know a lot of people who consider this book pivotal in awareness of the AIDS crisis, and I don't disagree, but I have to think of the book as a content piece, but also as a book. And as a reader, it was way too slow and way too long for me, and I could have had the same impact in a lot less time. Her message is strong and emotional and personal, but it's also really wordy and slow. Now, Michael Crouch narrates the book, and I think he's a great narrator. He does a really nice job of distinguishing his voice from male and female characters, and he makes really clear choices with each of the characters that make them recognizable. I had to, not because of Michael Crouch, but rather because of the writing, speed this book up. I almost always listen on regular time. I like to hear the narration the way the narrator intended it. But in this case, there was no way I was getting through this book if I didn't help myself with a little bit of a speed increase. Now, Michael Crouch's narration held up at a faster speed, which is a credit to his ability, but I just couldn't get through the slog of this book without a little help. If you're someone who's sensitive to triggers, please double check your resources before you dig into this book. The most obvious trigger is AIDS, but there are others in the story. Now, you might wonder, why would you pick up a book about something so tragic and depressing that's theoretically behind us, in a way you could argue? But to me, that's exactly why you read a book like this, because it reminds you about the struggles people have been through and will go through again, and it reminds you to be empathetic to your fellow humans. We're only on this planet for a short while, and we're with a small group while we're here when you consider the scope of history. So why not learn what others have gone through and open your mind a little bit? It never hurts to be nice to people and to learn where they're coming from. So, did I love this book? No, not really. Did I find it a little bit depressing? Yeah, for sure. Could it have been faster paced? Definitely. Am I really glad I read it though? I am. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. I hope you like and subscribe. See you next time.